Hello, good morning.
Good
Good
morning.
morning.
Welcome. You guys all awake? Coffee ready? We ready?
We're ready to
Coffee
go.
is ready.
Coffee's
I
here.
hope everybody that's watching has their cup along with us.
Well, welcome. We're excited about today's topic. And I'm sure there's going to be extra questions or things that we'll follow up with in the comments afterwards because this is always a heavy topic, but very important. So we're talking about 3 actionable tips for analytics and metrics. And so, talking to you, small business owners, marketing professionals, if you think you should have done something a couple years ago, those types of things. So this is a lot of helpful ideas for you to take a look at. We really want to discuss foundational things. How do you know what to prioritize? Like, how do you know if you're making progress? And I'm looking forward to hearing this as well. Jed, I'll let you introduce yourself once it's as soon as we transition. But for me, I work with a lot of clients, and we always talk about vanity metrics and like things that to me don't matter, but sometimes they matter to people. And so, it's sometimes it's hard. You have to know what's important for growth, and then maybe what's important for your boss or somebody else.
Yeah.
So can't wait to hear your take on all of these items. So just, let you kick it off. Go ahead and just say a quick hello, and then let's start with tip number one. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. So I'm Jed Jones, CEO of Jlytics, and I've been in the world of marketing and data since I've been working. So over 25 years. My sweet spot is where marketing and data intersect. So I'm a data scientist, I'm a marketer, and I really shine when it comes to putting those two things together and helping business owners and agencies do more with their data.
Cool. Cool.
Yeah. Should
Awesome.
I go
We
ahead
are
and
so
launch in?
excited
Yeah.
to have you. You're actually our first guest. So,
Excellent.
for our sessions. So, we're thinking we're liking this format. Would love to hear the feedback from our audience as well as we progress with this. But since you have so much experience, Jed, I'm sure that it's kind of difficult to condense it down to 3 tips. So, I guess we'll keep this kind of high level, and maybe if we get a lot of questions and stuff, we'll invite you back for another session to kind of talk, go into a deeper dive in one particular area. But would love to hear what you thought tip number one should look like.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you. I'm honored to be your first guest, and I'm excited. So before I go into tip number one, and I'll touch upon what both of you have said, and I think that's a great point, is there's so much to data and analytics, but that overwhelms a lot of people to where they think, I'll just start that tomorrow or next week because there's so
Mhm.
much to do. Um, what I would invite everyone to look at is think of it like a spiral that goes like this, bigger and bigger and bigger. So each of the tips we're going to go through today, you can start small, and then kind of you can revisit those and go like a spiral pattern, right? Up and up. And so you're really revisiting the same kinds of ideas and thoughts. But as you get more comfortable with it, as you build out your systems and thinking about it, you can always add more. So it's better to start somewhere. And I think Kristina and Debra both said this, but start somewhere and then work your way from there versus just being like, oh my gosh, what do I do? I'm just not going to do it at all, which is what some folks do. And it's understandable. So tip number one would be setting your foundation. So this is a combination of setting up your tracking systems as well as your thought processes around what your business goals are. So it's a little bit of both, and they go hand in hand. Some concrete examples. So I'm going to use specific product names like Google or HubSpot in our conversation today, but those are just placeholders. So if you have other systems that you use, that's okay. Google, obviously, I call it the Google ecosystem, is a big one, and a lot of people use it, so it's a good example. But feel free if you have other analytics software that you use, maybe that you've already started using. It doesn't mean you can't apply what I'm saying to those things, because you absolutely can. But let's use Google, and I might mention HubSpot for a little bit. So starting with Google, so you set up your ecosystem. So Google has something called Google Analytics, and all that is it's a free platform. It's, I think, probably one of the best free pieces of software out there today. And what it does is it allows you to, it's basically a doorman. If you imagine, if you've ever been to a large building where they have someone at the front checking people on the way in with a little counter, essentially that's what Google Analytics is. Not only does it check you when you walk in the front door, but it checks each different room you go in, which might be in this analogy might be the different pages, how
Oh,
long
that's
you were,
yeah.
how long they were there, who went in, what their general demographics are. That's becoming harder and harder to track, by the way, but things like that. It's amazing how much data Google Analytics can pull together for you on your behalf for your website visitors just based on that alone. So it sounds simple, and it is simple at that level. What's cool is they spin that data up into many different reports and things that you can use. Some of them are custom reports that you can build yourself once you get into it, but a lot of them are just built-in reports that just kind of ship with Google Analytics, and so it's easy to get started with it. And so the Google Analytics is a part of that ecosystem. And the reason I call it the Google ecosystem is we typically advise our customers to set up these accounts using the same login. So you go and create a Gmail account, for example, and you'll set up Google Analytics. And if you decide to, for example, run Google Ads, you might set up Google Ads campaign. If you have a Google My Business, if someone does a search for you and you come up on Maps or on Google, that's Google My Business. They used to call it Google Business Profile. They changed their name a few times. So that's what that is. So setting these different things up. And one other piece I want to mention is something called Google Tag Manager. That is kind of that could be a whole topic in itself. So we probably won't go into too deeply into it today. But think of Tag Manager as kind of the central brain that can manage these different things. If you set up Google Tag Manager, you can still you can and should still go into those individual accounts. You'd still run your reports in Google Analytics. You'd run your reports in Google Ads. You'd check out your Google Business Profile. But Tag Manager is a way to simplify how the tracking pixel that has to go on your website to make all this happen. You just have to put one Google Tag Manager tracking pixel on your website, and then everything else as far as the tags and pixels goes gets managed inside Tag Manager. So you're not calling your webmaster every 3 days saying, hey, can I add another tag to my website? In fact, Google Tag Manager even allows you to add things like Facebook tracking and many other products, not just Google products. So think of it like a tag system. That's probably as deep as I'll go into Tag Manager for today. But the point I want to get across is you can link all these things together and should, so that they're all singing from the same songbook, so to speak. So that's it. And then I'll just mention also part of tip A before we move on to tip number 2 here. So tip 1 would just be thinking about your business goals. So you get some things set up. You've got your ecosystem set up. You've got tracking going on. You may have an ad campaign. These are things that you're doing, and you're starting to look at that data as it comes in and make it a daily practice. Just let's see, how many visitors did I get? Things like that. The other thing you want to do is your business goals have to be set up. So you have to think about, what do I want to get out of my campaign, whether it be a digital campaign, whether you're doing traditional media like TV, radio, any of those things. Any of these things apply, by the way, not just to the digital world, but your entire marketing campaign. Digital is easy to talk about because it's very trackable, but all the tips we talk about today can apply to your email campaign and other things as well. So it's not limited to digital. But your business goals is really important. So knowing how many sales or leads or downloads or whatever it is that's important to you, how many of those should be happening each week, each month? You should have a good sense of that, not just a vague sense, but you should write down numbers that are goals. And you start converting those goals into metrics, which leads us into tip number 2. So I'll leave it right there for that one.
I have a question, Jed. You just sort of hit something, and I've been in marketing a long time, but analytics, especially Google's sort of structure, has gotten much more complicated. So I find myself sort of falling behind. But do you find that, like at the early business, is having a goal of traffic okay? Or should you really focus on the smaller things, even if they're much more rare? I don't know if that question makes sense, but
I do. It does make sense. Yeah, that's a great question, Kristina. So just something as simple as how many visits did I get? Now they Google calls visits sessions now, but how many sessions did I get? And I still use the word visit sometimes. And so that's a great place to start. There's something else that Google's introduced called engagement rate. And so what that means is, let's say you had 100 visitors in a given period of time, let's say a month, just to keep it simple. If you had 100 visitors come to your website, and let's say that 30 of them were engaged visitors, and I'll explain what engaged means in a minute. So 30 out of 100, that means you have a 30% engagement rate. Now, what is engaged? Well, Google, a few years ago, when they rolled out the new Google Analytics 4, they decided, hey, we need to look not just at visitors, but people who actually got to the website and did something important. So an engaged visitor is somebody who stayed on the a site for more than 10 seconds, or went to more than one page, or triggered what's called an event. An event is something we can go into, but it's something you set up yourself and say, hey, this is significant to me. Maybe it's a download or a certain page you go to. If any of those three things are true, that person is now an engaged visitor. If they just get there and don't do one of those three things, then they're not an engaged visitor. It makes sense because you want people, not just the raw numbers, but what did they actually do when they got to the site?
Well, good.
Yeah, I think we used to put a lot of weight on page duration to try to calculate that in the past. Yeah.
I agree. That's a big one for sure. And I will review a few of the metrics that I tend to look at in a few minutes here, and page duration is definitely one of them.
Okay. All right, let's jump into tip number 2 then.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, great. So tip number 2, and this is all kind of flowing together. So the first one, just to reiterate, is setting up your systems and processes, and making sure you know what your business goals are. Now that you have your business goals, your processes, you're ready to start doing some measuring of things. Okay, and so measuring, and the fancy word we use for it in data science is metrics, and that just means measuring something with numbers. Usually measurements are going to be in terms of absolute counts, like how many were there, or percentages like engagement rate, how many out of 100 were there that did a certain thing. They can also be other things like amount of time on a website, like Debra mentioned with page duration or visit duration. And there are others having to do with dollar values, like cost per acquisition, things like that. So with metrics, and like I mentioned earlier, we want to start simple. So it could be traffic. Some of the top metrics that I like to recommend my clients look at when they first launch a campaign would be engagement rate. We talked about that a minute ago. Cost per conversion. I'll circle back to that in a second. Cost per acquisition. And then let's start with those right now. And of course, things like number of visits, duration, things like that. These are all things that you can find in your Google Analytics. Now, cost per conversion. Let's circle back to that for a minute. That's a big one. So back when we talked a few minutes ago about setting up your Google ecosystem, one of those things you can do is set up what's called an event, which I touched upon a little bit. An event is anything you want it to be. Okay. Now, typically, an event could be something like they went to this particular page and they scrolled down more than 80% of the way. That could be an event. Or they submitted a web form request and the thank you page popped up. That's an event. It's only an event if you want it to be. I've had clients who set up 3 events, and I've had clients who set up 35 events. It really depends on what you want to measure. What you want to think about is if you set up too many events, it becomes kind of meaningless. Like if everything's significant, nothing is significant, right? So you want to focus on the ones that really matter. It can be easy to get kind of carried away with all the events. But that being said, sometimes there's very legitimate reasons to have 20 or 30 events. A lot of my clients will do things like, oh, someone downloaded this particular piece of, PDF file or something like that, or watched a video that was important, they think, to their conversion cycle on their website. So the takeaway there is an event is anything you want it to be. And once you set up in Google Tag Manager, going back to that one, what an event is, and then when an event happens, when someone actually does that thing on your website that you told it is now an event, it sends a little message to Google Analytics, okay, because they're connected. That's why we link them together. And now when you run a report in Google Analytics, it actually shows you how many of those events occurred of each type. That's really important. Now, going back to the conversion, this all links together. What is a conversion? Well, a conversion is what in Google Analytics now they call a key event. All a key event is let's say you set up 10 events, okay, 10 different things that matter to you. 4 of those might be really important. Like, wow, I consider that a conversion. I'm going to mark that as a key event in Google and Google Tag Manager. And actually, you actually mark it as a key event in Google Analytics, but it's set up in Tag Manager. Once it's a key event, now it's like, okay, this is a really important event. I really want to make sure I'm measuring this. You can measure maybe 5, 10, 20 events, and then a subset of those are key events. You can then import those key events into Google Ads. So if you happen to have a Google Ads campaign running, and you don't need to make this work, but if you do, that can be imported into Google Ads as a conversion. So now if you have a Google Ads campaign running and you send traffic to your website and they do that thing that's an event and it's been marked as a key event, that will then register in Google Ads and helps Google Ads get smarter about who to target. All that to say, events, conversions, and key events are all kind of related. They have slightly different nuances depending, but they all mean basically something very significant happened. So I'll leave the event conversation there, but again, that's a good conversation to get into further on another topic, another day. But what's cool is you can set up any event you want. You can set up, it's the sky's the limit to your event. It's limited only by your imagination. And then you have to set it up correctly in Google Tag Manager so it talks to Google Analytics.
I like,
In
yeah.
my last, yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
Yes.
before you get to tip number 3,
Yes.
we have a question from the audience that I think is appropriate to address right now. And Lori writes, she works with a company that seems to only value site traffic and bounce rates. And of course, those are very important for us. We don't want to be labeled as spammy with, any of our stuff, right? Feels like there's more valuable metrics to discuss with them. So how do we convince them to look deeper? And I'm imagining it's something around their pocketbook that would get them to, or wallet, get them to stand, sit up and take notice. How would you address that, Jed?
Excellent question, Lori, and thank you for kind of rephrasing that as well, Deborah. So what I would say, this is a very common thing. So bounce rate is actually being used less and less in the newest version of Google Analytics. Google Analytics 4, GA4, got rolled out a couple years ago, but now it's the only game in town. You used to be able to use this or the older one. GA3, the older one, really used bounce rate as an important thing. Bounce rate just has to do with how many people actually just come to your site and just leave without going to more than one page. Bounce rate's kind of a negative. A higher bounce rate is actually worse. You want a lower bounce rate, so it has a negative implication or connotation. And so Google, when they did the rethinking about GA4, they said you can still find bounce rate on GA4, but it's less important now. Flipping that almost on its head is the engagement rate. So it's kind of the inverse of bounce rate. Not exactly, but think of it like the inverse. Engagement rate, if you had 100% engagement rate, that would be like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. But even 30, 40, 50%. So Lori, I would say an easy way to make sure you're transitioning these analytics and growing them would be look at engagement rate. And then I would also go in and set up events. By the way, you can set up events directly in Google Analytics. You don't have to use Tag Manager. I highly recommend you use Tag Manager. It's not a huge step to do that. But if you, for some reason, just didn't want to do Tag Manager, there are ways to set up events directly in Google Analytics. But I think a combination, Lori, of looking at engagement rate, which is already built into GA4 if you're using Google Analytics, and then adding some events, which you have to add yourself. You have to build those events. Once you do, they're going to be in the system. That's where I would go next with what you're looking at.
Awesome.
Thank you. Yeah. So tip number 3 then.
Absolutely. So tip number 3 is going to be monitoring. Okay, monitoring on an ongoing basis. So when you start thinking about that spiral pattern we talked about, so you might start with sessions, engagement rate, certain kinds of events or conversions. And you start, what's really important, we were just talking the other day, I was talking with Debra and Kristina about the idea of consistency in marketing. And it's important to look at Google Analytics that way as well. And again, I'm using Google as an example, but I'm talking about any kind of analytics, your email marketing analytics, any kind of analytics you're doing, Facebook analytics, if you're using Facebook to analyze your audiences and things. Consistency is key. Become familiar with your data. That's the biggest kind of recommendation I can give you in terms of ongoing monitoring, because you start training your brain. Okay, so for a lot of people, especially if you're a very creative person, a lot of people who are super creative sometimes just don't look at data because it's like, oh, that's for someone else to do. But what's really neat about metrics and things is once you actually start looking at them regularly and training your brain every day, every week, whatever consistency you're comfortable with, your brain starts looking for the significant differences. If you just look at a number by itself out of context, it's like, well, is this good or bad? I don't know. But if you start looking at trends over time and you start looking at this number and start making yourself think about, is this important? Is this going in a good direction? Is it going in a not good direction? Those are things that you start getting used to. So data is not just about setting it all up and then having it somewhere that you could go check it if you wanted to, but you don't ever really check it. You actually have to go check it, and that's important. So it's kind of easy to say, okay, I checked that off the list. I've done it. Okay, I've set up my systems. I've set up my metrics. Now I actually do your monitoring. So what does that entail? It's going to entail a combination of regularly reviewing your analytics. In other words, and I think really to get started, I would do it for 5 minutes a day. Go into your Google Analytics or whatever software you're using, 5 minutes a day. Look at the key reports. Make sure you adjust the date range. There's usually a date range feature in there that tells you what you're looking at. You might look at the last 7 days. You might look at yesterday. If you had a big email launch, email campaign, or some kind of new product launch on your website, you might want to check for certain pages. Whatever time frame makes sense, and look at that regularly, and even get your team members to look at it. And maybe once a week, write up a little email to your team that says, hey, here's 3 things I took away from my analytics this week, team. Or maybe it's once a month. Let people know, get your team involved so that the whole team, whether you're working by yourself, then talk to someone you know really well, talk to a friend or coworker or customer, somebody, an advisor, and just say, hey, here's how our analytics are looking. Become conversant in the language. Start small, start simple, and just rinse and repeat. And then that spiral, you start adding more and kind of going out as you start. Because what's neat too is you start looking at thing A and you think, now that I have been tracking thing A for a long time, it really makes me wonder, why is thing A happening? Oh, well, if I look at thing B, I could look at what might be causing thing A. Then you start becoming more intellectually curious about what could be causing that. That's really the power of data. It's like you're like a detective. You're following that you're following that trail from the scene of the crime, whatever's happened, backwards to what might have occurred before that, and that is where you really are going to start getting your power with analytics, is getting into that detective mode, if you will, and looking, and then you got to be a reporter. You got to communicate that out to your team as well.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
Any sense of like, I know this is analytics focused, but obviously you learn things from analytics and you try to improve the website or other things on the other end. Like, how long do you think you give before you either say it's something I'm doing is not working? Do you give like a month? Do you give 3 months? Do you give a week? Like, how long do you try to wait for incremental improvements? Like,
that is an excellent question. Okay, thank you. So what I would say with that is, I would think about it not so much in terms of how long, but in terms of how much data have you collected. So, for example, let's just oversimplify and say we're running a Facebook ads campaign to our website, and we're driving 1,000 clicks to our website a month. I'm just making these numbers up. You might have enough time in 1,000 visits to know whether something's working. But if you turn your budget down to 1/3 of that, now you're looking at 333 visits a month or whatever. You may have to wait longer to know what actually is happening. But time is not irrelevant either, because if you're looking at an email campaign, for example, people, you might get a certain, 80% of the opens will happen on day one, then another maybe 5% on day two, and it'll kind of trail off, for the next week or so. So in that case, time does make a difference. Whether you're sending it to 80,000 or 80 people, you're going to have a certain percentage that look at the first day and kind of trail off. So time is not irrelevant at all. It's relevant, but I would look at the amount of data you've collected as really start getting a feel for that. And you're looking for what the stats nerds like me call statistical significance. Even if you don't have someone to go calculate that statistical significance for you, you'll start getting a sense as you do campaigns. Okay, whatever I just did, whatever action I took out in the real world, this has now had enough time to have an effect. Am I seeing the effect, or am I not? And it's really easy to err on. I think you kind of implied that too, Kristina. It's really easy for people to say, "Gosh, if something's not working, I'm going to quickly change direction, do something totally different." You might not really know yet, so it's easy to get kind of skittish and say, well, this thing didn't work, so I'm just going to, so data also kind of gives you that sense of kind of just staying the course, but then realizing, also reading the tea leaves and saying, okay, my data has now told me this either worked really well, I'm going to do more of that, or this didn't work as well as I thought, I'm going to try something else. Either way, the data is kind of like a clock. It gives you a sense of that timing, that cadence. That if you just do it in a vacuum without the data feedback, you're going to be probably making erring on either side of either too risky or too conservative in terms of how you react to that.
Got it.
I tend to, I think that a lot of the small business owners that I've talked to over the past year or so, they tend to look at their analytics on a monthly basis. They're trying to accumulate data before they look at it. So I think this gives them a new perspective to kind of be monitoring it all along the way. And then, look at it cumulative over that month's course, as well as, in retrospect, going back to previous months to kind of make more informed decisions about do I need to add video for more engagement, or, what is it missing, right? And play around with that and see if those little tweaks can improve that stickiness. We used to call it stickiness on the website.
Yeah. That's a great point.
So I didn't prep you, Jed, for this question, but it did pop in my head. So I hope you don't mind. But
of course.
I'm wondering, and I know you worked with a lot of different companies and size companies and all types of people, but is there a most common quick fix that you see up front? I know there's a lot of steps to working through analytics, metrics, and goal setting, but is there typically a really an easy win, a quick fix that you see that happens early with clients?
It is going to be different by client, but one thing I would say that would be the closest answer to that would be, if you're doing any kind of campaign, I do recommend building a specific landing page for that campaign rather than just sending it to your homepage.
Right.
And this relates to your question / comment, Kristina, because if you're just kind of sending traffic to your website, it's an open field. What's going on? Who's going where? Sometimes a homepage can be a legitimate landing page for sure, but oftentimes for a specific campaign, it's too general because you're looking for a certain audience. You're trying to get them to do a certain kind of thing, and the homepage is too. So a quick fix in that, it's not quick, but it's probably the closest thing to quick you can get, is to drive traffic to a specific page, and then really become a student of what happens on that page. Look at where they go next. How long did they stay? If you run a certain campaign, keep track of those campaign dates. Don't just run it and turn it on, turn it off. Keep a record somewhere when it ran, and then really start optimizing to that one page. Or if you have 3 campaigns, you have 3 different things, 3 pages, that's fine. But let that be your laboratory rather than your entire website, which can be a little overwhelming. Some people went here and someone went there, and it starts becoming. So that's what I'd probably say is get really focused on what's happening when they get to your website and become a student of that.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think we all get distracted easily these days, right?
Absolutely.
So to your point, directing them to one location rather than come onto the website and all of a sudden they're going, oh, let me click on this. Let me click.
Exactly. And Debra, I know we have about a minute left, but I just wanted to also, when you mentioned monthly versus daily, one thing to think about too is if you're the data person or the marketing person or a little bit of both, you might monitor every day, or weekly at the very least, but maybe you only report to your team once a month. So you're able to kind of become that really informed person. And really, if someone asks you a second or third level question, you've been looking at it all the time. So you're going to have that answer versus, let me get back to you. So you might differentiate between how often you look at it and what you report back to the team.
Yeah, that's smart. And you just reminded me, because it can be a challenge with clients sometimes making sure they do prioritize this enough, because what happens I've seen is, suddenly it's the end of the year and there's a board meeting and they want to share data. And like, you didn't care about it for 11 months. And, it's a reminder to me to just keep educating the people we work with and pushing some of those conversations, because, it's right there. I mean, I was around for marketing when you didn't have this much data. So it's really a treat that you do have that access. Like even Google reviews, you can see when someone's unhappy very fast. People used to pay for that information. So it's, you got to embrace it, I guess.
Yeah.
Very true. Very true.
Just to summarize what Jed and we've talked about today, it's set the foundation, set the goals, measure, right? So measure on conversion, engagement, set up those events and those key events, use the tag manager to help make sure that you're getting the right data, right, back from the system, monitor, become that expert of understanding what those interactions are with your brand on your website, right? So Jed, you've knocked it out of the park for us today. We really do appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us. And let us know what other questions you guys have. We would love to have Jed come back on and dive a little bit deeper into
Yes.
whichever area the audience feels is important to them.
Yeah, let me get my notes done and then Jed can come back.
Well, again, it was an honor to be on with you both and with everyone else who joined today. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you.
100%.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the week.